The summer of 1987 arrived in Cologne with unusual warmth, bringing with it a false sense of peace that would soon shatter the lives of two families forever. The Meyer and Schneider families had always been close, bound not just by blood, but by decades of shared history, Sunday dinners, and the kind of unwavering loyalty that small, tight-knit German communities pride themselves on. Both families lived in Lindenthal, an affluent neighborhood where tree-lined streets hosted well-maintained homes and residents knew each other's business, sometimes more than they should. Thomas and Elizabeth Meyer had built what everyone considered an exemplary life. Thomas, 52, worked as a senior accountant at a prestigious firm downtown, his reputation for precision and integrity unmatched. Elizabeth, 49, had been a schoolteacher before retiring early to focus on family. Their only son, Daniel, had just turned 24. Tall, with dark blonde hair and intense blue eyes, Daniel had graduated from the University of Bonn with a degree in business administration and recently secured a position at a consulting firm in Düsseldorf. He commuted 2 hours each way, but insisted on living at home, claiming he wanted to save money before finding his own place. Just 3 blocks away lived Elizabeth's younger sister, Margaret, and her husband, Johann Schneider. Johann managed a successful pharmacy that had been in his family for 3 generations, while Margarete worked part-time as a nurse at the local clinic. Their daughter, Sarah, was 21, with auburn hair that fell in soft waves past her shoulders, and hazel eyes that seemed to constantly search for something beyond the predictable rhythms of Lindenthal life. She attended nursing school, following in her mother's footsteps, though her heart wasn't entirely in it. On weekends, she worked at her father's pharmacy, organizing inventory and helping customers, her smile polite but distant. The two families gathered every Sunday without fail. It was tradition, sacred and unbreakable. Elizabeth would prepare elaborate meals, her kitchen filled with the scents of sauerbraten, potato dumplings and apple strudel. The adults would discuss politics, business, and neighborhood gossip, while Daniel and Sarah retreated to the conservatory or the garden, as they had since childhood. Everyone remarked how wonderful it was that the cousins remained so close despite their age difference. Daniel had always been protective of Sarah, teaching her to ride a bike, helping with homework, defending her from bullies at school. Their bond seemed natural, innocent, the kind of relationship families pointed to with pride. But something had shifted in recent months, something nobody noticed at first. When Daniel returned from university the previous year, Sarah had just turned 20. She was no longer the awkward teenager he remembered, but a young woman with opinions, dreams, and a quiet intensity that drew him in ways he didn't want to acknowledge. During family gatherings, their conversations grew longer, more private. They began texting daily, then multiple times a day. Daniel started finding excuses to visit the Schneider house when he knew Sarah would be alone. She would do the same, stopping by the Meyer residence with transparent reasons, a borrowed book to return, a recipe her mother needed. By spring of 1987, the line between cousin affection and something far more dangerous had blurred completely. It started innocently enough, or so they told themselves. Late-night phone calls that stretched past midnight. Long walks through Stadtwald, the city forest, where they could talk without interruption. Daniel confided in Sarah about feeling suffocated by parental expectations, the pressure to excel, to marry appropriately, to follow a predetermined path. Sarah shared her own frustrations, the sense that her life had been planned without her input, that she was meant to be a dutiful daughter, a good wife someday, nothing more. One evening in April, after a particularly tense family dinner where both sets of parents had discussed Sarah's future marriage prospects with uncomfortable enthusiasm, Daniel offered to walk Sarah home. The night was cool, stars visible despite the city lights. They stopped at a small park halfway between the two houses, sitting on a bench beneath an old oak tree. The conversation turned to their childhoods, shared memories, the safety they had always found in each other. Daniel reached for Sarah's hand, ostensibly to emphasize a point, but neither pulled away. The touch lingered, charged with an electricity neither had felt before. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes reflecting confusion and something else, something neither wanted to name. Daniel leaned closer, telling himself he was just comforting his cousin, but when their lips met, the pretense evaporated. The kiss was brief, tentative, followed immediately by panic. They pulled apart, both stammering apologies, insisting it meant nothing, that it wouldn't happen again. But the boundary had been crossed, and both knew in the devastating silence that followed that everything had changed. In the weeks that followed, they tried to maintain distance. Daniel threw himself into work, accepting extra projects that required late nights at the office. Sarah picked up additional shifts at the pharmacy and spent more time at the clinic with her mother. At Sunday dinners, they barely made eye contact, speaking in polite, clipped sentences when forced to interact. The adults noticed the sudden coolness between the cousins and attributed it to growing pains, to Daniel's work stress, to Sarah's demanding school schedule. Elizabeth mentioned to Margaret that perhaps the two needed time apart, that they had been too dependent on each other growing up. Margaret agreed, relieved that her daughter seemed to be focusing more seriously on her studies. But proximity and shared family obligations made true distance impossible. In mid-May, during a celebration for Johann's birthday, Daniel and Sarah found themselves alone in the pharmacy's back office, searching for extra chairs. The room was small, cluttered with boxes and paperwork. As they maneuvered around each other, their bodies brushed, and the careful control they had maintained for weeks crumbled. This time there were no apologies, no pretense that it was an accident. They kissed with desperate urgency, months of suppressed desire, overwhelming reason and morality. Sarah's back pressed against the filing cabinet as Daniel's hands tangled in her hair. They barely heard the footsteps approaching until Johann's voice called out, asking if they had found the chairs. They sprang apart, faces flushed, breathing ragged, and Daniel grabbed two folding chairs, emerging from the office with forced casualness. From that night forward, they stopped fighting what had ignited between them. They began meeting in secret, developing elaborate cover stories. Daniel told his parents he had joined a gym and left the house in workout clothes, only to pick up Sarah from a predetermined corner 2 streets away. She told her parents she had study groups that ran late, meeting Daniel instead at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city where nobody knew them. They rented a room at a modest hotel in Brule, registering under false names, spending stolen afternoons in a space that existed outside the judgment of family and society. The guilt was constant, gnawing at both of them. They knew what they were doing was wrong, not just socially unacceptable, but fundamentally transgressive. German law didn't prohibit relationships between cousins, but cultural attitudes, especially in conservative Catholic communities like theirs, viewed such unions with deep suspicion and moral condemnation. The church teachings they had absorbed since childhood labeled their relationship as sinful, a violation of natural order. Yet they couldn't stop. The secrecy itself became intoxicating, a shared rebellion against the suffocating expectations that had governed their entire lives. By July, their families remained oblivious, wrapped in the comfort of routine and assumption. The Meyer and Schneider households continued their Sunday traditions, summer barbecues, and weeknight dinners. Thomas boasted about Daniel's success at work, suggesting he would make partner within 5 years. Margaret spoke proudly of Sarah's excellent grades, mentioning several young men from respectable families who had expressed interest. Daniel and Sarah sat through these conversations with frozen smiles, hands clenched beneath the table, playing their roles with practiced ease, while their secret life burned beneath the surface, waiting for the inevitable moment when everything would come crashing down. August arrived with oppressive heat that seemed to mirror the mounting pressure Daniel and Sarah felt closing in around them. They had been carrying on their secret relationship for 4 months, each encounter deepening their connection while simultaneously amplifying their guilt. The hotel room in Brule had become their sanctuary, a place where they could pretend the outside world didn't exist, where family ties and social judgment couldn't reach them. But reality has a way of forcing itself through even the most carefully constructed illusions. It was Sarah who first noticed something was wrong. Her cycle, usually predictable to the day, was late. At first, she dismissed it as stress from nursing school exams and the constant anxiety of maintaining their deception. But when the second week passed without any sign, a cold dread settled in her stomach. She said nothing to Daniel, hoping desperately that her body would correct itself, that this was just a temporary disruption. She threw herself into her studies and work at the pharmacy, trying to ignore the subtle changes she was beginning to feel. The tenderness in her breasts, the waves of nausea that hit her at unexpected moments. By the 3rd week of September, denial was no longer possible. Sarah purchased a pregnancy test from a pharmacy in Ehrenfeld, a neighborhood far enough from Lindenthal that she wouldn't risk being recognized. She locked herself in the public restroom of a department store, hands trembling as she unwrapped the test. The 2 minutes she waited felt like hours, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain others could hear it through the stall door. When the result appeared positive, she stared at it in disbelief, then tested again with the second kit she had bought. Same result. Sarah sat on the closed toilet seat, test still in her hand, and felt her entire world collapse. She couldn't tell Daniel immediately. The enormity of what this meant paralyzed her with fear. They weren't just 2 people who had made a mistake. They were cousins, their families intertwined in ways that made this pregnancy not just scandalous, but potentially catastrophic. Sarah thought about abortion, but in 1987 Germany, the procedure was heavily restricted, legal only under specific circumstances, and required counseling sessions that would inevitably lead to questions she couldn't answer. Going to a doctor she knew was impossible. The medical community in Cologne was tight-knit, and word would spread quickly. 5 days after confirming her pregnancy, Sarah finally told Daniel. They met at their usual hotel room, and the moment he saw her face, he knew something was terribly wrong. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, unable to look at him, and whispered the words that would change everything. Daniel's reaction was immediate and visceral. The color drained from his face, and he sank into the chair by the window, head in his hands. For several minutes, neither spoke, the weight of their situation filling the small room like toxic air. Daniel's first instinct was to find a solution, to fix the problem before anyone discovered the truth. He suggested they find a clinic in the Netherlands, where abortion laws were more permissive and they could maintain anonymity. Sarah considered it, desperately wanting an escape from the nightmare unfolding before them, but something held her back. Maybe it was her Catholic upbringing, maybe the fear of the procedure itself, or perhaps some deeper instinct she couldn't articulate. She told Daniel she needed time to think, that she couldn't make such a decision while in shock. Over the following weeks, they explored every possible option. Daniel researched clinics in Amsterdam and Belgium, calculating costs and travel logistics. They discussed telling their parents and running away together, starting over in another city where nobody knew their history. Each scenario seemed equally impossible. Running would raise immediate suspicions and destroy both families. Going abroad for an abortion carried risks of complications and the psychological burden Sarah wasn't sure she could bear. And continuing the pregnancy meant an inevitable revelation that would shatter the carefully maintained facade both families lived behind. Meanwhile, Sarah's symptoms intensified. Morning sickness became a daily ordeal that she struggled to hide. At home, she claimed to have caught a persistent stomach bug from the hospital. Margarete, with her nursing background, monitored her daughter with growing concern, insisting Sarah see their family doctor. Sarah deflected, saying she had already been examined at the clinic and was told it was a viral infection that would pass. The lie bought her time, but added another layer of stress that manifested in sleepless nights and a gnawing anxiety that followed her everywhere. At Sunday dinners, maintaining normalcy became increasingly difficult. Sarah pushed food around her plate, claiming she still wasn't feeling well. Elizabeth fussed over her, offering homemade remedies and expressing worry that perhaps Sarah was working too hard. Daniel watched his cousin across the table, seeing the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she reached for her water glass. His own guilt was consuming him from the inside, manifesting in irritability at work and withdrawn behavior at home. Thomas commented that his son seemed distracted lately, suggesting he might be burning out from his demanding job. By mid-October, Sarah was approaching her 3rd month of pregnancy. Her body was beginning to change in ways she could no longer completely hide. She started wearing looser clothing, layering sweaters, even as the weather remained mild. At the pharmacy, her father noticed she had gained weight and made an offhand comment about her healthy appetite returning. The casual observation sent panic through Sarah, a reminder that time was running out, that soon the truth would become physically impossible to conceal. Daniel became increasingly desperate, his careful, methodical nature giving way to frantic attempts to control an uncontrollable situation. He withdrew money from his savings, researching private clinics that offered discretion for a price. He drafted letters they could leave if they decided to disappear, explaining nothing while trying to minimize the damage. But every plan fell apart under scrutiny, leaving them trapped in a tightening vice with no clear escape. The breaking point came in early November. During a particularly difficult bout of morning sickness, Sarah fainted at the pharmacy. Johann found her collapsed in the storage room and immediately called an ambulance, despite her protests. At the hospital, a young doctor examined her, asked routine questions about her medical history, and ordered standard tests. When he returned to the examination room, his expression was serious but not unkind. He told Sarah, with her mother present, that she was approximately 12 weeks pregnant. The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret stared at the doctor, then at her daughter, her face cycling through confusion, shock, and dawning horror. Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but watch as her mother's world shattered in real time. The doctor, sensing the family crisis unfolding before him, quietly excused himself, leaving mother and daughter alone in the sterile examination room where the carefully constructed lies of the past months finally crumbled into devastating truth. The drive home from the hospital was suffocating in its silence. Marguerite gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, her jaw clenched so tightly Sarah could hear her teeth grinding. Sarah sat pressed against the passenger door, staring out the window as familiar streets blurred past, each block bringing them closer to a confrontation she had desperately hoped to avoid. The pregnancy was no longer a secret she could bury, but the identity of the father remained her last defense, a truth so devastating she would protect it at any cost. When they arrived home, Johann was still at the pharmacy. Margaret led Sarah directly to the living room, closing the curtains as if shielding the house from prying eyes, though no neighbors could possibly know what had just been revealed. She sat across from her daughter, hands folded in her lap with forced composure, and asked the question that would echo through the coming weeks with increasing desperation. Who is the father? Sarah had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times, preparing various lies and misdirections, but now, Faced with her mother's anguished expression, the carefully crafted stories evaporated. She opened her mouth and found herself unable to speak at all. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and Sarah's terror of what would happen if the truth emerged. Margaret's composure began to crack, her voice rising as she repeated the question, demanding answers, insisting that whoever had done this would be held accountable. Sarah finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, claiming it was someone from university, a brief relationship that had ended months ago. She refused to provide a name, insisting he had moved to another city and wanted nothing to do with her or the pregnancy. The lie was weak, transparently so, and Margaret's nursing background made her immediately suspicious. She pressed harder, asking why Sarah hadn't mentioned this relationship, why there had been no indication of her dating anyone, why she was protecting someone who had abandoned her. The interrogation continued for hours, Margaret cycling between anger, confusion, and maternal concern. She wanted to understand how her careful, responsible daughter had ended up in this situation, pregnant and unmarried in a community where such circumstances brought immediate and brutal judgment. When Johann returned from the pharmacy that evening, Margaret met him at the door, pulling him into their bedroom before he could greet Sarah. The muffled sounds of raised voices filtered through the walls as Margaret told her husband what she had learned. Johann's reaction was volcanic. He stormed into the living room where Sarah sat frozen, demanding to know the name of the man who had ruined his daughter's reputation. His face flushed red with rage, veins visible at his temples as he threatened to find this mysterious boyfriend and make him take responsibility, legally and financially. Sarah dissolved into tears, repeating her story with slight variations that only made it less believable. Johann wasn't fooled, his pharmaceutical precision extending to detecting inconsistencies in his daughter's account. But her stubborn refusal to provide details left him impotent in his fury. The Schneider household transformed overnight into a prison of tension and suspicion. Margaret called the nursing school, claiming Sarah had a family emergency and would be taking a leave of absence. She contacted the pharmacy, informing them Sarah would no longer be working there. The explanation given was vague, citing health concerns. But in a neighborhood like Lindenthal, vague explanations bred speculation. Johann instructed his daughter to remain at home, forbidding her from seeing friends or attending any social functions. They would figure out how to manage this disaster privately, away from the judgmental eyes of neighbors and extended family. The most immediate problem was the upcoming Sunday dinner at the Meyer house. The tradition couldn't be broken without raising questions, but Johann and Margaret dreaded the prospect of sitting across from Elizabeth and Thomas, maintaining pleasant conversation while their world collapsed internally. They debated cancelling, claiming illness, but decided that would draw more attention. Instead, they agreed to attend but keep Sarah home, saying she was still recovering from her fainting spell. Sunday arrived with cruel normalcy, the autumn sun bright and indifferent to human suffering. At the Meyer residence, Elizabeth prepared her usual elaborate meal while Thomas set the table, commenting on how pleasant it was to have these weekly gatherings. When the Schneiders arrived without Sarah, Elizabeth immediately expressed concern, insisting that Margaret should have stayed home to care for her daughter. Margaret deflected with practiced ease, explaining that Sarah was simply exhausted and needed rest, that it was nothing serious. Daniel had known something was catastrophically wrong the moment his aunt and uncle arrived without Sarah. His phone had been silent for 3 days, his texts to Sarah going unanswered, his calls going straight to voicemail. The fear that had been building in his chest now exploded into full panic. Throughout dinner, he watched his aunt carefully, noticing the tightness around her eyes, the forced quality of her laughter, the way her hands trembled slightly when she reached for her wineglass. Johann was even more transparent, barely speaking, pushing food around his plate with mechanical movements. After the meal, while the adults settled in the living room with coffee, Daniel excused himself, claiming he needed to make a work call. He slipped into his father's study and tried Sarah's number again. This time she answered, her voice a ragged whisper. In hurried, fragmented sentences, she told him what had happened at the hospital, how her mother knew about the pregnancy, but not about him, how she was essentially being held captive in her own home. Daniel's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan, but before he could respond, Sarah whispered that someone was coming and abruptly ended the call. Daniel returned to the living room, his face pale and expression strained. Elizabeth asked if everything was all right, noting that he looked unwell. He claimed the call had been about a difficult client, nothing important, but his distraction was obvious. He barely participated in the rest of the evening, responding to questions with monosyllables, his thoughts consumed with Sarah's situation and the terrifying realization that discovery was now inevitable. As the Schneiders prepared to leave, Margaret pulled Elizabeth aside in the hallway, her composure finally cracking. She confided, in a voice thick with emotion, that Sarah was going through a difficult time, that there were personal issues she couldn't discuss, but wanted her sister to be aware of. Elizabeth embraced Margaret, promising support without prying, respecting the boundaries her younger sister was clearly establishing. The moment was tender and tragic, two sisters sharing pain while the true nature of the crisis remained hidden, a bomb waiting to detonate and destroy everything they held dear. Back at the Schneider house, the interrogations resumed with renewed intensity. Johann had contacted a lawyer friend, inquiring hypothetically about paternity suits and financial responsibility. Margarete scheduled an appointment with their family doctor, insisting Sarah receive proper prenatal care regardless of the circumstances. But the central question remained unanswered, suspended in the air like a guillotine blade. Who is the father? The answer, locked behind Sarah's terrified silence, would soon emerge in the most devastating way possible, transforming a family scandal into an unthinkable tragedy that would echo through generations. The first week of November brought unseasonably cold weather to Cologne, frost-coating windows and bare tree branches glittering in the pale morning light. Inside the Schneider household, the temperature felt even colder. Sarah moved through the house like a ghost, confined to her room except for meals, which she ate in strained silence while her parents watched her with a mixture of concern and barely concealed anger. Johann had taken to drinking whiskey after dinner, something he had never done before, while Margarete obsessively cleaned already spotless rooms, her way of maintaining control when everything else was spiraling. Daniel was unraveling. At work, his performance had deteriorated so dramatically that his supervisor called him in for a formal meeting, expressing concern about missed deadlines and uncharacteristic errors in client reports. Daniel apologized, blaming personal stress, and promised improvement he knew he couldn't deliver. His thoughts were consumed with Sarah, trapped and alone, carrying their child while he remained helpless on the sidelines. He had tried calling again, but her phone was apparently confiscated. He considered showing up at the Schneider house, but knew that would raise immediate suspicion. The communication blackout lasted 9 days. Then late on a Tuesday night, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was Sarah using her mother's phone while Margarete slept. The message was brief and desperate. "They know something is wrong with my story. My father hired an investigator." Daniel stared at the screen, his blood turning to ice. A private investigator would uncover the truth within days, maybe hours. Their fictional boyfriend would be exposed as non-existent, and the investigator would inevitably look closer to home, examining Sarah's actual relationships and activities over the past months. Daniel typed back frantically, We need to tell them before they find out." Sarah's response came after a long pause. "I can't. It will destroy everything." But Daniel knew the decision was no longer theirs to make. The truth was closing in, and how it emerged would determine whether there was any possibility of damage control or if the revelation would be as brutal and destructive as possible. The investigator, a retired police detective named Klaus Weber, was thorough and efficient. Johann had hired him under the pretense of locating Sarah's former boyfriend to establish paternity and financial responsibility. Weber started with Sarah's phone records, which Johann provided, expecting to find evidence of a mysterious relationship. What he found instead was far more disturbing. The most frequent contact in Sarah's call history was Daniel Meyer, her cousin. Hundreds of calls and texts over the past 6 months, many late at night, many during times when Sarah had claimed to be at study groups or work. Weber expanded his investigation, interviewing staff at the nursing school who confirmed Sarah had no boyfriend they were aware of, that she kept to herself and rarely socialized. He checked with the pharmacy employees who reported the same. He then made discreet inquiries at hotels in surrounding neighborhoods, showing photographs of both Sarah and Daniel. At a modest hotel in Brühl, the desk clerk recognized them immediately, confirming they had rented a room there multiple times under the name Schmidt, always paying cash, always checking in mid-afternoon. When Weber presented his findings to Johann on a grey Thursday afternoon, the pharmacist sat in stunned silence, the folder of evidence open on his desk. Phone records, hotel receipts, witness statements, all painting an inescapable picture. His daughter and his nephew had been conducting a secret relationship for months. The implications crashed over Johann like a physical blow. This wasn't some stranger who had taken advantage of Sarah. This was family. This was Daniel, the boy he had watched grow up, the son of his wife's sister. The pregnancy suddenly took on a dimension of horror Johann hadn't conceived possible. Johann didn't tell Margaret immediately. He sat in his study that evening, the investigator's report in his hands, reading and rereading the evidence as if repetition might change the conclusions. He poured himself a large whiskey, then another, trying to numb the shock and disgust churning in his stomach. Finally, near midnight, he walked upstairs to the bedroom where Margaret was reading, her reading glasses perched on her nose. He handed her the folder without speaking, watching as she opened it, her expression moving from confusion to comprehension to absolute devastation. Margaret's scream brought Sarah running from her room. She found her parents in their bedroom, her mother collapsed on the bed, sobbing, her father standing rigid by the window, his back to them both. The investigator's report lay scattered across the floor, photographs and documents exposing everything they had worked so desperately to hide. Sarah's legs gave out and she sank to the floor, unable to form words, unable to do anything but watch as her parents' pain became a tangible force filling the room. Johann turned slowly, his face a mask of cold fury that terrified Sarah more than any explosion of temper could have. He spoke in a low, controlled voice that shook with barely contained rage. How long has this been going on?" Sarah couldn't answer, her throat closed with fear and shame. Johann picked up one of the hotel receipts, holding it up. "Since April, longer." Sarah managed a small nod, confirming what the evidence already showed. Margaret's sobs intensified, her hands covering her face as if she could block out the reality unfolding before her. The questions came in a torrent after that initial break in the dam. How could they have done this? Did they not understand how fundamentally wrong it was? Were they so selfish, so blind to morality and consequence? Sarah had no answers that would satisfy, could offer no explanation that would make sense of the incomprehensible. She whispered that they hadn't meant for it to happen, that they had tried to stop, but the words sounded pathetic even to her own ears. Johann made a decision immediately. He picked up the phone, his hands steady despite the emotional earthquake shaking his core, and called the Meyer residence. Thomas answered, his voice cheerful and unsuspecting. Johann asked to speak with Daniel, his tone making clear this was not a social call. When Daniel came to the phone, Johann said only 6 words: "I know everything. Come here now." Then he hung up, leaving Daniel standing in his parents' hallway, the phone still pressed to his ear, knowing that the moment of reckoning he had dreaded for months had finally arrived. Daniel arrived at the Schneider house 20 minutes later, having driven through empty streets with his mind blank, unable to process anything beyond the immediate necessity of facing what he had done. Johann opened the door before Daniel could knock, pulling him inside and steering him roughly into the living room where Sarah sat on the couch, her mother beside her, both their faces ravaged by tears. The investigators' report was spread across the coffee table, a documentary of their betrayal laid out in clinical detail. What followed was less a conversation than an evisceration. Johann's anger was cold and surgical, each question designed to expose the depth of their transgression. When had it started? How many times had they been together? Had they ever considered the consequences? Did they understand they were cousins, that what they had done violated every moral boundary their families held sacred? Daniel tried to speak, to accept responsibility, but Johann cut him off, his contempt palpable. "You have destroyed your family and ours. You have created a situation that cannot be fixed, cannot be undone." Margarete finally spoke, her voice hoarse from crying. "The baby." Her words hung in the air, forcing everyone to confront the central issue that had brought this crisis to light. There was a child coming, a child conceived in what their families would view as an unnatural union, a child whose very existence would be a permanent reminder of this catastrophe. She looked at Sarah with something between pity and revulsion. "What have you done? What have you brought into this world?" The meeting ended with Johann ordering Daniel to leave, forbidding him from any contact with Sarah. There would be conversations with both sets of parents, decisions to be made about the pregnancy, but those would happen through official channels, lawyers perhaps, not through direct contact between the two people who had caused this devastation. Daniel left the house in a daze, knowing that when he returned home, he would have to tell his own parents that the bomb had finally detonated, and the fallout would consume everyone he loved. Daniel sat in his car outside his parents' house for nearly an hour, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. The lights were still on inside, his parents likely watching television or reading before bed, their lives still intact, still normal. In a few minutes, he would walk through that door and shatter their reality as completely as his own had been shattered. Finally, knowing he couldn't delay any longer, he forced himself out of the car and into the house. Thomas and Elizabeth were in the living room, exactly as he had imagined. His father looked up from the newspaper, his mother from her knitting, both smiling at their son's return until they saw his face. Elizabeth set her knitting aside immediately, maternal instinct alerting her to crisis. Daniel stood in the doorway, unable to move further, and said the words that would end life as his family knew it. "Sarah is pregnant. The baby is mine." The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas's newspaper slipped from his hands. Elizabeth's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Daniel continued, his voice mechanical, explaining everything, the relationship that had developed, the months of secrecy, the pregnancy discovered at the hospital, the investigators' report. His parents listened in a state of shock so profound they seemed frozen, unable to process information that contradicted everything they believed about their son, their family, their carefully constructed world. Thomas was the first to react, rising from his chair with a fury Daniel had never witnessed. He didn't shout, his anger too deep for volume. "You have destroyed this family." Every word was enunciated with terrible clarity. Elizabeth began to cry, not the gentle tears of sadness, but harsh, gasping sobs that shook her entire body. She looked at Daniel as if seeing a stranger, unable to reconcile the son she knew with the man who had committed this unthinkable act. The phone rang an hour later. It was Johann, his voice tight with controlled rage, informing Thomas that both families needed to meet immediately to discuss the situation. The meeting was arranged for the following evening at the Schneider house. Neutral territory, since neither family could bear the thought of hosting such a conversation. Daniel was ordered to his room like a child, his parents unable to look at him, the air in the house thick with betrayal and disgust. The family meeting was brutal in its civility. Both sets of parents sat in the Schneider living room, speaking in measured tones, while Daniel and Sarah were kept in separate rooms, forbidden from seeing each other. The adults discussed options with the grim practicality of people managing a disaster. Abortion was raised, but immediately dismissed. Sarah, now at 16 weeks, passed the point where the procedure was easily accessible in Germany. Adoption was considered, but the question of genetic health complications hung unspoken in the air. It was Margaret, with her medical background, who finally voiced what everyone was thinking. Pregnancies between first cousins carry increased risks of genetic abnormalities. The statement fell into the conversation like a stone into still water, ripples of horror spreading outward. Elizabeth's hand went to her mouth. Thomas closed his eyes. Johann's jaw tightened. They had been so focused on the moral catastrophe, they hadn't fully considered the medical implications of consanguinity. Margaret insisted Sarah see a specialist immediately, not their family doctor who would ask too many questions, but someone in Bonn who could provide comprehensive genetic screening without judgment. The appointment was made for the following week, both mothers accompanying Sarah, the young woman's body, now a battleground of competing fears. Shame over what she had done, warring with terror about what might be growing inside her. The specialist, Dr. Hoffmann, was a middle-aged woman who had seen enough complicated cases to maintain professional detachment. She performed a detailed ultrasound, her expression neutral as she examined the fetus, taking measurements, checking development markers. When she finished, she sat down with Sarah and the two mothers, her face serious. "There are concerns." The words hung heavy. The fetal heart showed structural irregularities. The facial bones were not developing symmetrically. Further testing was necessary, but Dr. Hoffmann explained gently that pregnancies between close relatives carried a significantly elevated risk of congenital abnormalities due to the increased likelihood of recessive genetic disorders expressing themselves. The ride home was silent, each woman trapped in private horror. Elizabeth and Margaret, sisters who had always been close, now sat separated by a chasm of shame and unspoken recrimination. Sarah stared out the window, her hand unconsciously on her belly, feeling the small movements of the life inside her, a life that might already be irreparably damaged by the choices she and Daniel had made. Additional tests over the following weeks confirmed the worst fears. The fetus had multiple abnormalities, heart defects that would require immediate surgery after birth, facial malformations that would be obvious and severe, potential neurological damage that couldn't be fully assessed until after delivery. Dr. Hoffmann presented the information with clinical precision, but her eyes held sympathy as she watched the young woman absorb the devastating news. The families faced an impossible decision. The pregnancy was too advanced for legal termination, and even if it weren't, the moral weight of that choice divided them. Johann wanted Sarah to carry to term, his Catholic faith forbidding abortion under any circumstances. Thomas argued that bringing a severely disabled child into the world under these circumstances was cruelty. The debates raged in hushed, tense meetings, while Sarah herself seemed to retreat inward. making no decision, simply existing as the pregnancy progressed inevitably toward an unknown conclusion. By February 1988, Sarah's pregnancy had reached its final weeks. She had been essentially invisible for months, confined to the house, her body swollen with a pregnancy that felt more like a curse than a blessing. The neighborhood whispered, "Of course." The Schneider's explanations about Sarah visiting relatives had worn thin, and when she was occasionally glimpsed through windows, clearly pregnant, the speculation intensified. Both families had become pariahs, their attendance at church and community events dropping to nothing as the weight of judgment became unbearable. Daniel had moved out of his parents' house in December, unable to withstand the suffocating atmosphere of disappointment and rage. He rented a small apartment in Ehrenfeld and continued working, though his relationships with colleagues had become strained. Someone had heard something, rumors spreading through professional networks, and Daniel found himself increasingly isolated, invitations to after-work gatherings drying up, promotions passed over without explanation. Labor began on February 19th, 3 weeks before the due date. Sarah's water broke in the middle of the night, and Margaret drove her daughter to the hospital in Bonn, far from Cologne where too many people knew them. Johann stayed behind, unable to face what was coming. The delivery was complicated, requiring emergency cesarean section when fetal distress became apparent. The operating room fell silent when the baby emerged. The infant boy was alive, but barely, his cries weak and irregular. The malformations were immediately visible and severe. His face was asymmetrical, features compressed on one side, eyes set at uneven levels. His skull shape was abnormal, and his limbs showed significant developmental abnormalities. The pediatric team worked quickly, whisking him to the neonatal intensive care unit, where machines could support his struggling heart and lungs. Sarah, still groggy from anesthesia, asked to see her son. The nurses exchanged glances before wheeling her to the NICU, preparing her as gently as possible for what she would see. When the incubator came into view, Sarah's reaction was visceral. She turned her head away, unable to look, her body shaking with sobs that were equal parts grief and horror. This was her child, created from love that had somehow twisted into something monstrous, a living embodiment of transgression and consequence. The baby survived 4 days. His heart, malformed and struggling, finally gave out on the evening of February 23rd. Sarah was present, her hand reaching through the incubator opening to touch his tiny fingers as the monitors flatlined. Margaret stood beside her daughter, both women crying silently. No other family members came to the hospital. Daniel had been forbidden contact, though he called repeatedly for updates. Thomas and Elizabeth couldn't bring themselves to see the child, the physical proof of their son's catastrophic choices. The funeral was held on a cold, grey morning at a small cemetery outside Bonn. Only Sarah, her parents, and Daniel attended, the 4 of them standing apart from each other around the tiny white casket. No pastor officiated, the service brief and wordless. The headstone would read only dates, no name, as if even acknowledging the child's existence was too painful. When the burial was complete, they left separately, unable to share even grief. The destruction that followed was total and irreversible. Johann and Margaret's marriage didn't survive. Margaret blamed her husband for being too strict, for creating an environment where Sarah felt she couldn't come to them with problems. Johann blamed Margarete for being too permissive, for not seeing what was happening under their roof. They divorced within a year, selling their house and moving to different cities. Their relationship with their daughter fractured beyond repair. Sarah disappeared from their lives entirely. After recovering physically from the delivery, she left Cologne without telling anyone where she was going. Margaret received occasional letters, postmarked from various German cities, brief notes assuring her mother she was alive, but providing no details. no forwarding address. Sarah worked menial jobs, moved frequently, and spoke to no one about her past. The trauma of what she had experienced manifested in severe depression and anxiety that she managed with medication and isolation, building a life defined by its emptiness. Daniel fared no better. His career collapsed when the full story leaked through family connections and professional gossip. He was let go from his firm, the termination officially attributed to performance issues, but everyone knowing the real reason. He moved to Munich in 1989, changed his surname, and started over in a different field entirely, becoming a warehouse supervisor, his university degree and professional ambitions abandoned. He never married, never had other children, the guilt of what he had created and destroyed, consuming any capacity for normal relationships. Thomas and Elizabeth's marriage survived, but became hollow. They moved to a smaller town in Bavaria, telling new neighbors they had no children, erasing Daniel from their history as if he had never existed. Elizabeth died in 1995 of a heart attack, the stress and grief having taken an irreparable toll. Thomas lived until 2004, his final years spent in bitter isolation, the son he once loved dead to him long before his actual death. The two families never reconciled. The sisters, Elizabeth and Margaret, spoke only once more, a brief phone call in 1992 where Margaret informed Elizabeth of the divorce. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Both women's voices strained, decades of closeness erased by a tragedy neither could forgive or forget. Sarah died in 2011, found in a small apartment in Hamburg. Her body discovered only when rent went unpaid. She was 44 years old. Among her few possessions was a single photograph of a baby's gravestone, the dates February 19th, 1988, visible. No one claimed her body. Daniel learned of her death through a genealogy website years later, the information appearing like a ghost from a past he had tried desperately to bury. He never visited her grave. The story of the Meyer and Schneider families became local legend in Lindenthal, whispered about in cautious tones, a cautionary tale about secrets and forbidden relationships. But for those who lived it, there was no moral to extract, no lesson that could justify the suffering. There were only the ruins of lives destroyed by choices made in desperation and desire, consequences that cascaded through generations, leaving nothing but grief and the permanent silence of a child who never had a chance to live.